Sodom and Gomorrah are two cities that have captured human imagination and thought for millennia. Mentioned in Genesis, these cities represent more than just names in biblical history. They are symbols of divine wrath in the face of human iniquity. In the biblical context, Sodom and Gomorrah are presented as examples of God's unwavering justice. According to the Genesis account, these cities were destroyed for their extreme moral depravity. The narrative begins with the visit of two angels to Abraham, informing him of the imminent destruction of the cities due to their sins. This divine warning sets the stage for the unfolding story of judgment and salvation. In the following minutes, we will understand how this event, which devastated both cities, is essential for understanding the divine plan. The Bible plays a crucial role in this understanding, for as believers, we must be prepared for what is to come. Abraham's role in this story is crucial. He intercedes before God to save the righteous who might exist in Sodom and Gomorrah, progressively reducing the number of righteous needed to prevent destruction, from 50 to 10, Genesis 18:23-32. This dialogue between Abraham and God not only shows divine mercy, but also the importance of justice and intercession. The cities are destroyed by a rain of fire and brimstone, marking a moment of divine judgment that resonates throughout the Bible and in the collective consciousness of many cultures. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah offers us a window into the divine principles of justice and mercy, and invites us to reflect on the nature of sin and judgment. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were located in the fertile Jordan Valley, a region known for its abundance and beauty. This valley was often compared to the Garden of Eden and the fertile lands of Egypt, Genesis 13:10. The geographical location of these cities played a crucial role in their development and eventual downfall, as wealth and prosperity can lead to corruption and a departure from divine principles. Before we continue, share this video with someone you love, whether via WhatsApp or even Facebook. Our greatest mission as believers is to spread the word of the Lord to as many people as possible. And if you enjoy studies like this, which make us reflect on our own attitudes, comment below "I want more," as this is the only way I will know if I should continue creating new content like this. The Jordan Valley, in Abraham's time, was a region of great strategic and economic importance. Its abundance attracted many and was an ideal place for settlement and a prosperous life. However, this prosperity also brought temptation and sin, eventually leading to divine condemnation. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is intricately linked to this geographical context, serving as a backdrop for the dramatic events that unfold. Besides their material wealth, the Jordan Valley was known for its cultural diversity. The inhabitants of the region were a mix of various tribes and peoples, contributing to an atmosphere of tolerance for various practices, some of which were considered abominable in God's eyes. This multicultural and permissive environment facilitated the proliferation of behaviors that eventually led to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The importance of the geographical context cannot be underestimated, as it provides a deeper understanding of why these cities fell into such depravity and how their surroundings contributed to their ultimate fate. The biblical narrative uses the historical and geographical context to illustrate the connection between material prosperity and moral decay, a lesson that remains relevant today. The era of Abraham is fundamental to understanding the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham, the patriarch of Israel, is a central figure in the Genesis account and plays a crucial role in interceding for these cities. His connection to Sodom and Gomorrah is established through his nephew Lot, who decides to settle in the fertile Jordan plain near Sodom, Genesis 13:12. Abraham is known for his faith and close relationship with God. This relationship is evident when God reveals to him the plan to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah due to their sins. Abraham, concerned about the fate of the righteous who might reside in these cities, intercedes before God in a series of dialogues that show both his compassion and sense of justice. Genesis 18:23-33. This act of intercession highlights the importance of mercy and justice in the biblical narrative. Lot, on the other hand, represents those who, though righteous, find themselves trapped in a corrupt environment. Lot's decision to live near Sodom reflects a choice based on material prosperity, a decision that will have significant consequences. The relationship between Abraham and Lot adds a personal dimension to the story, showing how individual decisions can have broader repercussions. The era of Abraham is also a time of divine promises and covenants. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah contrasts with the promises of blessing and prosperity that God makes to Abraham. This contrast highlights the duality of divine justice, blessing for the righteous and judgment for the wicked. The narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah, therefore, is not just a story of destruction, but also a lesson about faithfulness and justice in the era of Abraham. The names of Sodom and Gomorrah have become symbols of corruption and divine judgment in the Bible. These names are laden with meaning and evoke images of destruction and sin. Sodom, in particular, has given rise to the term sodomy, historically used to refer to sexual acts considered perverse, especially male homosexuality. The significance of these names goes beyond their use in the Bible. In the historical and cultural context, Sodom and Gomorrah represent cities that reached extreme levels of moral depravity. According to Ezekiel 16:49-50, the sins of Sodom included pride, abundance of bread, idleness, and not helping the needy, besides the abominations committed. These sins reflect a society that had lost its sense of justice and compassion. Gomorrah, though less mentioned, shares the same fate as Sodom and is associated with the same levels of iniquity. The name Gomorrah also evokes the idea of judgment and destruction, being destroyed along with Sodom by the rain of fire and brimstone. Genesis 19:24-25. The duality of their names reflects the gravity of their transgressions and the divine punishment they faced. In the biblical narrative and later interpretation, the names of Sodom and Gomorrah served as a warning about the consequences of sin and the disregard for divine laws. These names continue to be used in literature and popular culture as synonyms for decadence and judgment. The story of these cities and the significance of their names remind us of the importance of living according to divine principles and justice. The Jordan Valley, where Sodom and Gomorrah were located, was known for its incredible fertility and beauty. This region is described in the Bible as like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, Genesis 13:10, being a place of abundance and prosperity. This material wealth was a crucial factor in Lot's decision to settle there, attracted by the promises of a prosperous life. The prosperity of the Jordan Valley not only attracted Lot, but also many others who sought to benefit from its natural riches. The abundance of resources allowed the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah to live in luxury and comfort, which eventually led to a lack of need to rely on God. This self-sufficiency and material complacency contributed to the moral decay that characterized these cities. However, the wealth and prosperity of the valley also brought spiritual challenges. The Bible points out that despite their abundance, the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were proud and did not help the needy, Ezekiel 16:49-50. This lack of compassion and social justice was one of the factors that led to their condemnation. The narrative suggests that prosperity without justice and compassion can lead to moral and spiritual ruin. The contrast between the beauty and fertility of the Jordan Valley and the moral corruption of its inhabitants underscores an important lesson. Material prosperity does not guarantee spiritual righteousness. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah invites us to reflect on how we use our material blessings and reminds us that true prosperity comes from living in harmony with divine principles of justice and compassion. Lot, Abraham's nephew, plays a crucial role in the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah. After separating from his uncle, Lot chose to settle in the fertile Jordan plain near Sodom, attracted by the wealth and beauty of the region, Genesis 13:11. This decision was not only strategic from an economic standpoint, but also revealing of his personal priorities, focused on material prosperity. Lot's choice has profound implications. By choosing to live in a region known for its moral decay, Lot exposed himself and his family to a corrupt and dangerous environment. Although the Bible describes him as a righteous man, 2 Peter 2:7-8, his decision to live near Sodom suggests a certain lack of spiritual discernment or an underestimation of the moral risks associated with his new home. This contrast between his personal righteousness and his choice of residence highlights the complexity of his character. Lot's life in Sodom was marked by constant internal conflicts. Although he was deeply disturbed by the conduct of his neighbors, he chose to remain there, perhaps for economic opportunities or the hope of being able to positively influence his surroundings. However, this permanence also plunged him into an increasingly precarious and dangerous situation, as evidenced by the dramatic visit of the angels and the threat of the mob, Genesis 19:9. The narrative of Lot and his choice to reside in Sodom offers a valuable lesson about the decisions we make and their consequences. It reminds us that the pursuit of material prosperity can lead us to compromise our values and expose us to negative influences. Lot's story is a warning about the importance of choosing wisely where and how we live, always keeping in mind our principles and the divine will. The Jordan Valley, where Sodom and Gomorrah were situated, is described in the Bible with a beauty and fertility comparable to the Garden of Eden and the fertile lands of Egypt, Genesis 13:10. This comparison is not casual, as both places symbolize abundance and divine blessing. The description of the valley highlights its potential for a prosperous and resource-rich life, attracting many, including Lot. The analogy with the Garden of Eden also introduces a spiritual dimension. Just as in Eden, the Jordan Valley represents a place of choice and temptation. In Eden, Adam and Eve faced temptation and fell into sin. Similarly, the inhabitants of the Jordan Valley, surrounded by abundance, succumbed to moral corruption. This narrative underscores how prosperity can become a test of character and faith. The attraction to the valley also highlights the temptation to seek the material over the spiritual. Lot's decision to settle in this fertile region reflects a desire for material security and comfort. However, as revealed later in the story, this choice brought significant spiritual and moral consequences. The beauty and fertility of the valley were not enough to counterbalance the depravity of its inhabitants, showing that material prosperity does not guarantee moral righteousness. The comparison with the Garden of Eden also serves as a warning about the decisions we make in the pursuit of a better life. It reminds us that while a place may seem ideal from a material perspective, it is essential to consider its spiritual and moral impact. The narrative invites us to reflect on how we balance our material aspirations with our spiritual and ethical responsibilities. The first signs of corruption in Sodom and Gomorrah are evident from the outset of their mention in the Bible. Despite their material prosperity, these cities were deeply immersed in immoral practices that alarmed God. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah due to their sins reached heaven, prompting divine intervention, Genesis 18:20-21. This outcry is an indication of the severity of their transgressions. The corruption of Sodom and Gomorrah manifested itself in various forms. Ezekiel 16:49-50 mentions that the inhabitants of Sodom were proud, had an abundance of bread and prosperous idleness, but did not help the needy. This lack of compassion and social justice was one of the main complaints against them. Additionally, their sexual abominations, including violence and homosexuality, exacerbated their moral depravity, making them extreme examples of immorality. The visit of the angels to Sodom further reveals the depth of their corruption. Upon their arrival, they are received by Lot, who offers them hospitality. However, the men of Sodom surround Lot's house and demand that the visitors be handed over to them so that they can abuse them sexually, Genesis 19:4-5. This act of violence and inhospitality not only shows their depravity, but also their disdain for the laws of hospitality and protection of guests, fundamental in the culture of the time. The first signs of corruption in Sodom and Gomorrah serve as a warning about how prosperity and complacency can lead to moral decay. The biblical narrative uses these examples to illustrate the consequences of pride, indifference to the needy, and immoral practices. It reminds us of the importance of remaining vigilant in our moral and spiritual lives, regardless of our material prosperity. Lot's hospitality is a central aspect of the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah. When two angels arrived in Sodom, Lot was sitting at the city gate, a place that denoted his position of respect and authority. Upon seeing the angels, Lot rose to meet them, bowed down before them, and offered lodging in his house. Genesis 19:1-3. This gesture of hospitality starkly contrasts with the conduct of the other inhabitants of Sodom. Lot's insistence on hosting the angels reflects his awareness of the dangerous environment of Sodom. Despite the angels' initial resistance to staying in his house, Lot insisted, knowing that their safety would be compromised if they spent the night in the public square. This concern shows Lot's sense of responsibility and protection for strangers, fulfilling the norms of hospitality of the time. Lot's hospitality is also tested when the men of Sodom surround his house and demand that he hand over the visitors so that they can abuse them. Lot goes out and begs them not to commit such wickedness, even offering his virgin daughters instead of the visitors. Genesis 19:6-8. Although this offer is disturbing from a modern perspective, it reflects Lot's desperation to protect his guests and fulfill his duty of hospitality, even at the cost of his own family. The arrival of the angels and Lot's response highlight the dichotomy between individual righteousness and collective corruption. Lot, despite living in a corrupt environment, remains righteous and protective, while the men of Sodom demonstrate their complete depravity. This contrast emphasizes the possibility of maintaining personal righteousness even in the midst of immorality, and underscores the importance of hospitality and protection of the vulnerable in biblical teachings. The violence and depravity of the men of Sodom are one of the main reasons for the city's destruction. The Bible describes how, before the visitors lay down, the men of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that he hand over the visitors so that they could sexually abuse them. Genesis 19:4-5. This violent and depraved behavior is a testament to the deep moral corruption that characterized the city. Lot's response to this situation is also revealing. Lot goes out to face the mob and pleads with them not to commit such wickedness. In a desperate act to protect his guests, he even offers his virgin daughters instead of the visitors. Genesis 19:6-8. This offer, though incomprehensible from our modern perspective, underscores the gravity of the situation and Lot's desperation to uphold hospitality and protect the visitors. The mob rejects Lot's offer and becomes even more enraged, attempting to break down the door to reach the visitors. At this moment, the angels intervene, miraculously blinding the men of the city to protect Lot and themselves. Genesis 19:10-11. This supernatural act not only saves Lot and his family, but also symbolizes the moral and spiritual blindness of the inhabitants of Sodom. The sudden blindness is a powerful symbol of the inhabitants' inability to recognize their own wickedness and the impending judgment. Even while physically blind, the men of Sodom continue to search for the door, showing their determination to commit atrocious acts and highlighting their moral and spiritual blindness. The divine intervention demonstrates God's mercy and protection towards Lot and his family. The angels, seeing the gravity of the situation, instruct Lot to gather his family and prepare to flee the city, informing him that destruction is imminent due to the severity of the outcry against the city that has reached the Lord. Genesis 19:12, 2-13. This announcement marks a crucial moment in the narrative, signaling the beginning of divine judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot tries to warn his future sons-in-law about the impending destruction, but they take it as a joke, not believing the seriousness of his words. Genesis 19:14. This disbelief reflects the total disconnect between Lot and the inhabitants of Sodom, even those closest to him by family ties. The lack of seriousness with which they take the warning underscores their ingrained corruption and inability to recognize the gravity of their actions. The persistent depravity and violence of the men of Sodom culminate in their total destruction. The temporary blindness they suffered is only a prelude to their ultimate fate. The narrative emphasizes that violence and depravity affect not only the direct victims, but corrupt the entire community, inevitably leading to judgment and destruction. This story serves as a powerful warning about the consequences of immorality and the importance of maintaining justice and compassion in our communities. Lot's offer to hand over his virgin daughters to the mob instead of the guests is one of the most disturbing moments in the biblical narrative. Desperate to protect the visitors under his roof, Lot offers his daughters as a last resort to appease the wrath of the men of Sodom, Genesis 19:8. Although unacceptable from a modern perspective, this act reveals the extreme measures Lot was willing to take to fulfill his duty of hospitality. In the historical and cultural context of the ancient Near East, hospitality was a sacred obligation. Guests were under the absolute protection of their host, who had to ensure their safety at any cost. Lot's offer to sacrifice his daughters, as horrible as it seems, illustrates the intensity of this obligation. However, this action also exposes the ethical tensions and conflicts involved in a situation of extreme desperation. Lot's act reveals the complexities of his character. While described as a righteous man, his willingness to sacrifice his daughters raises questions about his judgment and morality. The narrative does not justify his action, but presents it as a demonstration of the depths to which Sodom had fallen, where even righteous people were forced to make impossible choices. Lot's offer highlights the deeply corrupt nature of Sodom. The men of the city not only reject his offer, but also demonstrate a complete lack of humanity and respect for the laws of hospitality. This disregard for Lot's offer and the continued violence underscore the inevitability of divine judgment. The narrative forces us to confront the realities of a society that has lost all sense of morality and compassion, setting the stage for its destruction. The divine intervention that blinds the mob is a crucial moment in the narrative, marking the supernatural protection of the angels for Lot and his family. When the men of the city try to break down Lot's door to attack the guests, the angels strike them with blindness, Genesis 19:11. This miracle not only prevents immediate violence, but also symbolizes the moral blindness of the inhabitants of Sodom. The physical blindness imposed by the angels has profound symbolic significance, representing the inhabitants' inability to see and recognize their own corruption and the severity of their sins. Even while physically blind, they continue to search for the door, showing their obstinacy and total disconnection from any sense of repentance or righteousness. The divine intervention also highlights God's protection and mercy for Lot. The angels, seeing the dangerous situation, act to save Lot and his family, demonstrating that God does not abandon the righteous, even amid the greatest corruption. This act of protection is a manifestation of divine justice, ensuring that Lot and his family have the opportunity to escape the impending judgment. However, the wealth and prosperity of the valley also brought spiritual challenges. The Bible points out that despite their abundance, the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were proud and did not help the needy, Ezekiel 16:49-50. This lack of compassion and social justice was one of the factors that led to their condemnation. The narrative suggests that prosperity without justice and compassion can lead to moral and spiritual ruin. The contrast between the beauty and fertility of the Jordan Valley and the moral corruption of its inhabitants underscores an important lesson. Material prosperity does not guarantee spiritual righteousness. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah invites us to reflect on how we use our material blessings and reminds us that true prosperity comes from living in harmony with divine principles of justice and compassion. The episode of the mob's blindness serves as a warning about the consequences of moral blindness. The inhabitants of Sodom's inability to see beyond their depraved desires and recognize their wickedness led to their destruction. This narrative emphasizes the importance of moral clarity and spiritual vision, showing that moral blindness can have devastating consequences not only for individuals, but for the entire community. After blinding the mob, the angels warned Lot and his family that they should flee the city without looking back. They instructed them to leave Sodom quickly, as destruction was imminent, Genesis 19:15-17. This warning underscores the urgency of the situation and the need for immediate action to save their lives, marking a point of no return in the narrative. The instruction not to look back is significant on several levels. Symbolically, it represents the need to completely abandon the past and not cling to the former life in Sodom. Looking back could be interpreted as a sign of regret or nostalgia for an immoral life, which is incompatible with the salvation God offers. This command also emphasizes the importance of absolute obedience to divine instructions to avoid judgment. Despite the clear warning, Lot's wife looked back while fleeing and was turned into a pillar of salt, Genesis 19:26. This act of disobedience and its immediate consequence illustrate the danger of not following divine instructions to the letter. The story of Lot's wife becomes an eternal warning about the risks of clinging to the past and disobeying God. The angel's warning and Lot's wife's transformation into a pillar of salt emphasize the need for faith and obedience. The narrative shows that to receive salvation, it is crucial to fully trust in God's instructions and not let attachment to a life of sin distract us from the path to righteousness. This lesson remains relevant for believers, reminding them of the importance of following divine guidelines with fidelity. After receiving the angel's warning about the imminent destruction of Sodom, Lot tried to save his future sons-in-law, who were engaged to his daughters. He warned them to get up and leave the city because God was going to destroy it, Genesis 19:14. However, his sons-in-law thought he was joking, reflecting their disbelief and disregard for the gravity of the situation. Their reaction highlights a total disconnect between Lot and those who had adopted the corrupt culture of Sodom. While Lot was a righteous man who understood the seriousness of the divine warning, his sons-in-law were so immersed in the city's decadence that they could not imagine something so catastrophic happening. The disbelief of Lot's sons-in-law is a reflection of the deep corruption that permeated Sodom. It also underscores the difference in perception of reality between the righteous and the wicked. While Lot, even living in Sodom, maintained his faith and discernment, his sons-in-law represented those who had lost all ability to recognize divine judgment and warning. Their refusal to take Lot's warning seriously resulted in their demise, highlighting the importance of being receptive to divine messages. The narrative of Lot's sons-in-law serves as a warning about the importance of listening to and acting on divine warnings. Disbelief and skepticism toward God's messages can lead to disastrous consequences. This story emphasizes that, to avoid destruction, it is crucial to be attentive to divine signals and respond with faith and action, acknowledging the seriousness of God's warnings. When the time came to flee, Lot hesitated, showing a reluctance to leave the city, despite the urgent warning from the angels. Lot seemed unable to abandon his life in Sodom, Genesis 19:16. This hesitation is significant as it reveals his emotional and material attachment to the city, reflecting the internal struggles of a righteous man caught in a corrupt environment. Lot's hesitation highlights divine mercy. Despite his indecision, the angels took hold of his hand, along with his wives and 2 daughters, and led them out of the city, demonstrating God's compassion and patience, Genesis 19:16. This act of mercy underscores that, even paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, God did not abandon Lot. Divine intervention ensures that Lot and his family have the opportunity to escape. This scene also emphasizes the importance of obedience and readiness to act. The narrative shows that salvation often requires a quick and decisive response to divine instructions. Lot's hesitation could have cost him his life, but God's merciful intervention gave him a second chance. This theme of grace and salvation even in the face of human doubts, is recurrent in the Bible, illustrating God's understanding nature. Lot's hesitation and subsequent divine mercy offer a powerful lesson about redemption. The narrative suggests that even those who hesitate and doubt can be saved by God's grace. Lot's story reminds us that salvation does not depend solely on our strength and decision, but also on divine mercy that intervenes in our moments of weakness and doubt. After the angel's warning, Lot and his family fled to the small town of Zoar to escape the imminent destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The angels allowed them to take refuge there, although they initially urged them to flee to the mountains. Genesis 19:17-22. The choice of Zoar as a refuge shows divine compassion, allowing Lot to find a safe place while destruction unfolded over the wicked cities. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is a cataclysmic event. God rained sulfur and fire from heaven, annihilating not only the cities, but also the entire plain and its inhabitants. Genesis 19:24-25. This act of divine judgment is a response to the deep depravity and sin that characterize these cities. The rain of fire and brimstone symbolizes purification and punishment, eradicating wickedness from the land. The account of the destruction also emphasizes the urgency and seriousness of divine warning. The speed with which the devastation occurred underscores that God's judgment is imminent and cannot be delayed. The narrative highlights the need for a quick and obedient response to divine warnings, showing that salvation depends on both faith and immediate action. Lot's choice to take refuge in Zoar, a small city, is also symbolic. Zoar represents a place of grace and mercy, a small portion of land spared from divine judgment. The narrative suggests that while God's judgment is severe, there is always a place for redemption and mercy. While fleeing from Sodom, the angels warned Lot and his family not to look back. Genesis 19:17. However, Lot's wife disobeyed this instruction and looked back, turning into a pillar of salt. Genesis 19:26. This tragic fate underscores the severity of disobeying divine instructions and the cost of clinging to a sinful life. The transformation of Lot's wife into a pillar of salt is rich in symbolism. Looking back can be interpreted as a sign of nostalgia and regret for the life left behind in Sodom. This act of disobedience reflects a lack of faith and trust in divine guidance, as well as a desire to cling to a corrupt past. The pillar of salt becomes a permanent reminder of judgment and the severity of the consequences of disobeying God. This event also serves as a warning for future readers of the Bible. The story of Lot's wife is mentioned in the New Testament by Jesus in Luke 17:32, where he warns his followers about the importance of not looking back while seeking salvation. The lesson here is clear. Faith requires total commitment and the willingness to completely abandon the sinful past to follow God's path. The narrative of Lot's wife also highlights the theme of obedience. The instruction not to look back was not just an arbitrary command, but a test of faith and trust in God. Disobedience led to immediate and severe punishment, underscoring that divine instructions must be followed to avoid destruction. This story emphasizes the importance of faithfulness and obedience in our relationship with God. The morning after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham got up early and went to the place where he had stood before the Lord. From there, he looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the plain, and saw that the smoke was rising from the land like the smoke of a furnace. Genesis 19:27-28. This sight is a moment of profound reflection and shock for Abraham, who had interceded for the cities. Abraham's view confirms the total destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The smoke rising from the ruins symbolizes fulfilled divine justice and the severe judgment on human depravity. For Abraham, this is a visual reminder of the seriousness of sin and the certainty of divine punishment. The devastation seen from afar contrasts with Abraham's previous intercession, highlighting God's unwavering justice when no righteous people are found. This event also marks a moment of reconciliation between divine justice and mercy, Although Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Lot and his family were saved, thanks to Abraham's intercession and God's mercy. Abraham's view of the fulfilled judgment underscores the importance of intercession and the hope of salvation, even in the midst of punishment. The narrative suggests that God hears the prayers of the righteous and acts with mercy. Abraham's reflection on the destruction can also be seen as a moment of reaffirmation of his faith. Despite the devastation, Abraham trusts in God's justice and goodness. This episode reinforces the idea that faith in God implies accepting both His justice and His mercy. Abraham's view of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah reminds us that while divine judgment is inevitable, faith and intercession can lead to salvation. Divine judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most striking acts of God's justice in the Bible. The decision to destroy these cities was made because of the severity of their sins, which had reached an intolerable level for God, Genesis 18:20-21. The execution of this judgment through a rain of fire and brimstone underscores the seriousness with which God deals with iniquity and moral corruption. The act of destruction is described with graphic details, highlighting the magnitude of the punishment. The fire and brimstone that fell from heaven not only destroyed the cities, but also the entire plain and its inhabitants, Genesis 19:24-25. This apocalyptic image serves as a powerful reminder of God's power and His ability to purge wickedness from the earth in a total and definitive manner. The total destruction symbolizes the necessary purification to restore justice. The narrative of divine judgment also highlights God's impartiality. Despite Abraham's pleas, 10 righteous people were not found in the cities, leading to their inevitable destruction. This episode emphasizes that divine justice cannot be compromised or negotiated. While God is merciful, He is also just, and His judgment is executed without favoritism. The story shows that divine justice is absolute and that wickedness cannot escape judgment. Divine judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a warning for future generations. Throughout the Bible, these events are referenced as examples of the consequences of living in sin, 2 Peter 2:6. The story emphasizes the importance of living in righteousness and obedience to God, reminding that while God is patient and merciful, He is also a just judge who punishes iniquity. Divine judgment and its execution urge us to reflect on our actions and live according to divine principles. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his daughters found themselves living in a cave in the mountains, having lost their mother and abandoned their home. Lot's daughters were concerned about the continuity of their family and made a desperate decision. Fearing that there were no men left to marry them, they decided to intoxicate their father and sleep with him to become pregnant, Genesis 19:30-32. This incestuous act by Lot's daughters, though morally reprehensible, reflects the desperation and isolation they faced. Each of the daughters intoxicated Lot on consecutive nights and became pregnant, Genesis 19:33-36. The children born from this union were Moab and Ben-Ammi, who became the ancestors of the Moabites and Ammonites, respectively. These peoples later played significant and often conflicting roles in the history of Israel. The consequences of these events highlight the complexities and challenges of survival after destruction. Although Lot was saved from the destruction of Sodom, the decisions made by him and his daughters led to morally complicated situations and a problematic legacy. The narrative does not excuse their actions, but shows how extreme circumstances and desperation can lead to morally questionable decisions. Lot's descendants, the Moabites and Ammonites, often conflicted with the Israelites, adding another layer of complexity to the story. The tensions between these peoples reflect how past events can have long-term repercussions on relations between nations and communities. Lot's story and his daughter's actions are not just a tale of survival, but also a warning about the lasting consequences of our actions. This part of the narrative also offers insight into divine mercy and justice. Despite the morally reprehensible actions of Lot's daughters, God did not destroy or punish them directly. Instead, the narrative focuses on the natural consequences of their decisions, underscoring that while God is just, he also understands human circumstances and acts with compassion. Lot's story and his daughters remind us of the importance of divine guidance and the need to remain faithful to moral principles, even in times of desperation. The narrative suggests that while circumstances may be extreme, it is crucial to seek solutions aligned with divine values. The lesson here is that desperation never justifies the transgression of moral principles, and that we should always seek God's guidance and mercy. The transgressions of Sodom and Gomorrah were not limited to the acts of sexual violence described in Genesis 19. The Bible mentions other iniquities that contributed to their destruction. Ezekiel 16:49-50 points out that pride, fullness of bread, idleness, and lack of help for the poor and needy were also great sins of Sodom. These hidden transgressions reveal a deeply corrupt and selfish society. Pride is one of the main transgressions mentioned. The inhabitants of Sodom considered themselves self-sufficient and felt no need for God. This attitude of arrogance and self-sufficiency led them to despise divine laws and live according to their own desires. Fullness of bread and idleness also reflect a life of excess and lack of purpose, where personal pleasure and comfort were more important than justice and compassion. The lack of compassion for the poor and needy is another serious sin attributed to Sodom. Despite their abundance, the inhabitants of Sodom did not help the less fortunate, demonstrating a total indifference to the suffering of others. This lack of charity and social justice is severely condemned in the Bible, as it goes against the divine commandments to love and care for one's neighbor. These hidden transgressions highlight the depth of corruption in Sodom and Gomorrah. The biblical narrative shows that the sins of these cities went beyond sexual immorality and violence. They were a combination of arrogance, excess, and lack of social justice. This complexity in their sins emphasizes the importance of living a balanced and just life, not only in terms of sexual morality, but also in how we treat others and use our blessings. The sin of indolence and arrogance in Sodom and Gomorrah is highlighted in Ezekiel 16:49-50, where it is mentioned that their inhabitants were proud, had an abundance of bread, and lived in carefree idleness without helping the needy. This combination of indolence and arrogance is particularly condemned because it reflects a complete disconnect from the values of justice and compassion that God requires of his people. The arrogance of the inhabitants of Sodom manifests in their self-sufficiency and disregard for the needs of others. They considered themselves superior and did not see the need to depend on God or show compassion to their fellow humans. This attitude of pride and self-sufficiency is seen as a serious transgression because it directly challenges the humility and dependence on God expected of believers. Indolence, or the lack of action to help the needy, is another serious sin. Despite their wealth and comfort, the inhabitants of Sodom did not use their resources to help the poor. This negligence and selfishness starkly contrast with biblical teachings on social justice and caring for one's neighbor. In Proverbs 21:13, it is warned that whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered. The combination of arrogance and indolence in Sodom and Gomorrah highlights the importance of social justice in the life of faith. The biblical narrative suggests that a life of excess and disregard for others inevitably leads to divine judgment. The story of these cities serves as a warning for communities and individuals to live with humility, compassion, and justice, using their blessings for the good of all. The relationship between sin and wealth in Sodom and Gomorrah is a central theme in the biblical narrative. These cities were known for their abundance and prosperity, which paradoxically led them to a life of sin and decadence. The context of material wealth in which the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah lived significantly contributed to their estrangement from God and their eventual destruction. The prosperity of Sodom and Gomorrah became a trap for their inhabitants. Instead of using their resources for the common good and helping the needy, abundance led to a life of excess and complacency. Gluttony, idleness, and arrogance, mentioned in Ezekiel 16:49-50, are examples of how wealth can corrupt if not managed with justice and responsibility. The biblical narrative warns that wealth without social justice is a recipe for moral decay. Wealth also contributed to the pride of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. They considered themselves self-sufficient and saw no need to depend on God. This attitude of self-sufficiency is condemned in the Bible, as the true purpose of material blessings is to honor God and serve others. In Deuteronomy 8:11-18, it is warned against the pride of attributing prosperity to oneself, reminding that it is God who gives the ability to acquire wealth. The narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah shows that wealth without justice and compassion leads to destruction. The relationship between sin and wealth in these cities serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing material prosperity to overshadow spiritual and ethical values. The lesson is clear. True prosperity comes from living in harmony with divine principles, using our blessings for the good of all and not just for personal benefit. Sexual violence and homosexuality in Sodom are explicitly mentioned in the biblical account as key factors for its condemnation. In Genesis 19, it is described how the men of Sodom attempted to sexually assault the visitors, angels who had arrived at Lot's house. This act of violence and inhospitality is one of the main examples of the city's moral depravity and one of the reasons God decided to destroy it. The Bible clearly condemns sexual violence, and the intent of the men of Sodom to violate the visitors is an extreme example of this transgression. This behavior not only demonstrates a lack of respect for the sanctity of the human body, but also a violation of the norms of hospitality and protection of guests. Sexual violence is seen as an abomination in the eyes of God, and this particular act underscores the severity of Sodom's corruption. Homosexuality, as mentioned in the context of Sodom, has been interpreted in various ways throughout history. In the biblical narrative, homosexuality is presented as one of Sodom's sins, Genesis 19:5-7. However, it is important to understand the context and scope of the practices that contributed to the condemnation of these cities. The Bible's approach to these themes often focuses on the violation of hospitality laws and the abuse of power and authority. Violence and disrespect for others' rights are consistently condemned in Scripture, regardless of the specific form they may take. The condemnation in the account focuses more on sexual violence and inhospitality than on sexual orientation itself. The Bible, in other passages such as Leviticus 18:22 and Romans 1:26-27, mentions homosexuality in the context of behaviors that deviate from divine norms. The role of sexual violence and homosexuality in Sodom's condemnation highlights the importance of living according to principles of respect and hospitality. The biblical narrative reminds us that sexual behavior and human relationships must align with divine commandments. The story of Sodom serves as a warning about the consequences of ignoring these norms and living in unchecked violence and immorality. Theological interpretations of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah have varied over the centuries, reflecting changes in religious and cultural understanding from antiquity to the present. This narrative has been used to teach lessons about morality, justice, and the nature of sin. Each interpretation offers a different perspective on the causes and implications of the destruction of these cities. In the Jewish tradition, Sodom and Gomorrah are seen as extreme examples of injustice and lack of hospitality. Rabbinic texts emphasize the social iniquity of the cities, including cruelty toward the poor and moral corruption. These interpretations focus on the idea that true justice requires compassion and care for others, and that the lack of these values leads to divine judgment. In the Christian tradition, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah has been interpreted in various ways. Some approaches highlight sexual immorality, particularly homosexuality, as the main reason for the destruction, However, many modern theologians also emphasize the importance of social injustice and lack of hospitality. In the New Testament, Jesus mentions Sodom and Gomorrah in the context of warnings about divine judgment and the need for repentance, Matthew 10:15. In contemporary theology, there is a growing emphasis on understanding the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in its entirety, including all aspects of its corruption. Scholars emphasize the need to address both sexual immorality and social injustice and lack of hospitality. This holistic perspective seeks to offer a more complete understanding of the biblical message, underscoring that the condemnation of Sodom and Gomorrah was multifaceted and not limited to a single type of sin. These theological interpretations throughout history show how the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah continues to be relevant and offers valuable lessons for all generations. The story prompts us to reflect on justice, morality, and compassion, and to consider how our individual and collective actions can align with divine principles. By understanding the variety of interpretations, we can gain a richer and more nuanced view of this powerful biblical narrative. The term Sodomite has evolved significantly over the centuries, and its usage has been shaped by cultural and theological changes. Originally, the term referred to the inhabitants of Sodom and was primarily associated with the narrative of their destruction due to iniquity. However, over time, Sodomite came to be used to describe acts considered perverse, especially in the context of male homosexuality. In early Christian and Jewish texts, the story of Sodom was used to illustrate the consequences of sexual immorality and social injustice. The term Sodomite began to be more closely associated with sexual acts deemed outside established norms. This association was reinforced in the Middle Ages, when homosexuality was increasingly condemned by religious authorities, and Sodomite became a pejorative term. In the modern era, the term Sodomite has been subject to re-evaluation and critique. Scholars and activists point out that reducing Sodom's condemnation to male homosexuality oversimplifies and distorts the biblical narrative. Texts such as Ezekiel 16:49-50 emphasize that the sins of Sodom included pride, gluttony, and lack of compassion for the poor, suggesting that Sodom's iniquity was multifaceted. Today, there is a growing recognition of the need to understand the term Sodomite in a broader and more accurate context. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a warning about a variety of immoral behaviors and should not be used to stigmatize specific groups of people. The evolution of the term reflects changes in ethical and theological understanding, highlighting the importance of interpreting sacred texts with care and sensitivity. Throughout history, various cities have been compared to Sodom and Gomorrah due to their moral corruption and eventual destruction. These analogies are used to warn about the consequences of iniquity and departure from divine principles. A notable example is the comparison of Yungay in Peru, devastated by an earthquake in 1970, with the biblical cities. Although this comparison is purely narrative and should be approached with caution and historical responsibility, Yungay, destroyed by an earthquake and an avalanche from Nevado Huascaran, was seen by some as a divine judgment similar to that of Sodom and Gomorrah. These comparisons generally arise in the context of natural tragedies, where massive and sudden destruction recalls the biblical narrative. However, it is crucial to understand that these analogies are interpretations and should not be taken as literal divine judgments. Another city frequently compared to Sodom is Pompeii, destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. The prosperity and moral decay of Pompeii, along with its sudden destruction, led to comparisons with the biblical cities. However, as with Yungay, these comparisons serve more to illustrate the fragility of civilization in the face of nature and moral judgment than to offer a direct theological explanation. Contemporary analogies with Sodom and Gomorrah invite us to reflect on how we interpret and understand catastrophes. While they can offer moral and ethical lessons, it is important to approach them with a critical and respectful perspective. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a reminder of the consequences of iniquity, but also prompts us to seek justice, compassion, and righteousness in our communities. The cultural legacy of Sodom and Gomorrah has endured over the centuries, influencing literature, art, music, and theology. These cities have become powerful symbols of moral decay and divine judgment, used to warn and teach about the dangers of sin and the importance of justice. The narrative of their destruction has been reinterpreted in numerous contexts, each bringing new perspectives and meanings. In literature, Sodom and Gomorrah have appeared in works by writers like Dante Alighieri, who in the Divine Comedy places the Sodomites in hell, symbolizing their eternal condemnation. This representation reflects the medieval view of homosexuality and other sins as deserving of severe punishment. The story has also been addressed by modern writers who seek to explore themes of morality, justice, and redemption. In art, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah has been a recurring theme. Renaissance painters like Peter Bruegel the Elder and Baroque artists like John Martin captured the dramatic scene of the reign of fire and brimstone. These visual works helped keep the narrative alive and convey its moral lessons in a powerful and accessible way to the public. Music has also been a medium to explore the legacy of Sodom and Gomorrah. Composers have created works reflecting the tragedy and redemption associated with these cities. For example, Georges Bizet's opera Les Pêcheurs de Perles includes themes of love, sin, and redemption that resonate with the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah. The cultural legacy of Sodom and Gomorrah is vast and multifaceted. These biblical cities continue to serve as potent symbols in various forms of artistic and literary expression, reminding us of the complexities of human morality and divine justice. The enduring nature of their story underscores its ongoing relevance and ability to inspire reflection and debate on ethical and spiritual issues. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible is rich in symbolism and has been used to convey various spiritual and moral lessons. The rain of fire and brimstone that consumes the cities, Genesis 19:24, represents not only divine judgment, but also the purification of the land from its iniquity. This symbolic act serves as a warning for the consequences of living in sin and straying from divine commandments. The symbolism of destruction also emphasizes God's justice. Throughout the Bible, the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah is referenced to illustrate the severity of divine judgment on iniquity. In the New Testament, Jesus mentions these cities as examples of what will happen to those who reject the gospel, Matthew 10:15. This use of symbolism underscores the importance of obedience and righteousness in the life of faith. Additionally, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah symbolizes mercy and the opportunity for redemption. Despite the destruction, Lot and his family are saved, showing that God distinguishes between the righteous and the wicked, Genesis 19:29. This aspect of the narrative highlights that even in the midst of judgment, there is room for grace and salvation for those who turn away from sin and follow God. Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt for disobeying and looking back, Genesis 19:26, adds another level of symbolism. This act symbolizes the consequences of disobedience and the danger of clinging to a sinful past. The transformation into a pillar of salt serves as a visual warning that faithfulness and obedience are essential to avoid destruction. The symbolism of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible is deep and multifaceted. Through this narrative, lessons about divine judgment, justice, mercy, and the need for obedience are conveyed. The story remains a powerful tool for teaching and reminding believers of the consequences of iniquity and the importance of living a righteous life. The narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah offers numerous moral and spiritual lessons that are relevant to believers of all ages. One of the most evident lessons is the importance of justice and compassion. The sins of Sodom, according to Ezekiel 16:49-50, include the lack of help for the poor and needy, highlighting that a just society must care for the most vulnerable and act with compassion. Another crucial lesson is the gravity of sin and its consequences. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah shows that iniquity does not go unpunished and that divine judgment is a reality for those who live in disobedience to God's commandments. This narrative reinforces the need for repentance and righteousness, reminding believers to live according to divine principles to avoid judgment. The account also teaches about the importance of intercession and mercy. Abraham's intercession for the righteous in Sodom, Genesis 18:23-32, highlights that prayer and supplication can have a significant impact. Although there were not enough righteous people to save the city, Abraham's intervention resulted in the salvation of Lot and his family, showing that God hears and responds to the prayers of the righteous. Finally, the story of Lot's wife serves as a warning about the need for obedience and the willingness to abandon the past. Looking back and clinging to a life of sin can result in the loss of salvation. The transformation into a pillar of salt symbolizes the consequences of disobedience and the importance of moving forward on the path of faith without hesitation. The moral and spiritual lessons from the account of Sodom and Gomorrah are profound and varied. From justice and compassion to intercession and obedience, these teachings offer valuable guidance for living a life aligned with divine principles. The narrative continues to be a source of reflection and learning for believers, reminding them of the fundamental truths of faith. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah provides deep reflection on divine justice and mercy. Through the narrative, it is shown that God is just and that iniquity must be punished. However, it also reveals God's mercy towards those who are righteous, like Lot and his family. This balance between justice and mercy is a central theme in the Bible and offers important spiritual lessons. Divine justice is clearly manifested in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities, known for their extreme depravity, faced God's judgment due to their sins, Genesis 19:24-25. The narrative emphasizes that God's justice is relentless when it comes to iniquity, underscoring the importance of living a righteous life. The severity of the punishment shows that wickedness and corruption cannot be tolerated. On the other hand, divine mercy is evidenced in the salvation of Lot and his family. Despite living amidst corruption, Lot is described as a righteous man, 2 Peter 2:7-8, and God decides to save him. This act of mercy demonstrates that God recognizes and rewards righteousness, even in the midst of widespread sin. The intervention of the angels to protect and guide Lot and his family underscores divine compassion. Abraham's intercession also reflects God's mercy. Abraham pleads for the city, asking if God would destroy it if there were righteous people in it, Genesis 18:23-32. Although there were not enough righteous people to save the city, God's willingness to listen and consider Abraham's plea shows his merciful nature. This dialogue highlights that God is willing to show mercy and that intercessory prayer can have a significant impact. Reflections on divine justice and mercy in the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah offer a balanced understanding of God's character. They remind us that while God is just and punishes sin, he is also merciful and seeks to save the righteous. This duality is fundamental to understanding the divine nature and urges us to live according to his principles of justice and mercy.